Okay, so just a reminder, I wanted to go through the cleanup and saving process again. And I also want to talk a little bit about this. In the last video, it wasn't letting me, for some reason, show the material when I changed the color. It looks like that was just an issue that was being caused with the video recorder. As soon as the recording stopped, then instantly colors came back. So you can play around with that, but in the long run, you're not going to be just using base colors on materials. What will be happening is that you're going to be creating your own custom textures and applying them. But another note, I will usually have my students go online to find images for this project, but then with a very strong warning that when they do so, this is the only time. From here on out, once you learn how to make your own materials or your own textures to apply to the materials, you need to make sure that all work is your own. So this is just a quick comment about plagiarism. Online, you can find a lot of different materials. You can find stuff that is tileable. You can find all sorts of really amazing things, but it's not your work. If you really want to develop your 3D skill development, especially the texturing portion, you need to do it. You need to make sure that everything is your own, that it's all custom. So I encourage you to, once we get to the portion of creating textures, so in a couple modules, make sure that you're practicing, and that through that process, you're going to be able to learn and develop and grow your skill set. So as far as cleanup, I'm going to remove these two objects. There are some issues that I'm not even going to deal with right now because we've already gone over them, but I just want to make you aware. So once again, with these objects, they're too high a resolution. And thankfully I can lower this resolution right now if I need to, so I can make that 8 sides. I can make this lower than that. But if you notice when I'm making changes, it's going to cause some issues. Window, Modeling Editor, UV Editor. When I change that after causing, or when I change the cylinder information or the history after making changes, it kind of spazzed out. This is where you may need to do something like deleting the history first and then making changes. But at this point, if I delete the history, I won't be able to make those poly tweaks. So before I make these types of UV mapping changes, I would need to make sure that the cylinder is set up how I want it. Otherwise, it's manually going through, deleting edges, things like that. And so just be aware that those histories can cause problems and issues, so be careful with it. This one I did not change or adjust the UV mapping, so I can easily knock this down and still have it mostly the same. You're going to notice that there's some deformation here. So if I go to Window, Modeling Editor, UV Editor again, there's a little bit of deformation here where it's going up, and the reason for this is that it has to calculate how this texture is being applied, where here it's just a perfect square and here it is not a perfect square. And so there's a little bit of bending and movement as it's trying to map out the texture across this surface. And in a lot of cases, that's just something that we have to deal with. We can either add in more geometry. So for example, when I come here and increase this to like 12, you see how it smooths it a little bit more because it has to make that deformation across a much smaller surface area. Or we have to just understand that things are going to be a little bit in the distance and the deformation is going to end up just being there, and you just got to deal with the texturing that way. So it's about trying to make good decisions. Once again, try fanning. I don't like it all going to the point with the triangles. I would want to cut across and make sure that's clean, but I'm not going to worry about that. The other portions that I want to remind you about the cleanup process right now are naming the objects, which have already been done, deleting history, delete it all by type history. If this was going to be a single object, I could do a mesh combine and make sure that that's at the pivot at the origin. In this case, these are 3 separate objects, and I don't want their default to be off to the side. So what I will do is I will bring them back to the origin, do modify freeze transformation to zero that out, and then for display purposes, then I will snap to grid and bring it out. Once again, for cleanup purposes, put that there at the origin, modify freeze transforms, bring that out. Oh. And same for this one, modify freeze transforms, so that they all do have that thing at the origin. I would go through regular cleanup So in this case, these are just primitives, so I'm not going to worry about it. Also, once again, I don't like the triangles, but I'm leaving it in primitive form right now just for this demo. But the basic cleanup after naming it, deleting history, freezing transforms would be to come to cleanup, select matching polygons, face with more than 4 sides, hit apply, and that way we would be able to find n-gons. I would go through the process of selecting by face and making sure that there are no faces on the edges. Going through selecting vertex, making sure there's no vertices in the middle of the edges, someplace they shouldn't be. It would be checking these in the outliner. Yep, just these 3 objects here in the outliner. Doing backface culling to check, which once it's turned on, backface culling is working. By the way, to create a skybox on lower end platforms, you can take half of a sphere, reverse the normals. Oh, let me go into the object mode, mesh display reverse, and you put a sky texture on the inside and put it over a world, and then you can create a skybox. So there's a lot of uses for having the normals going in opposite directions. But anyway, so yeah, so the backface culling has been checked. A final thing I might do, once again, is if I really need to, delete a face just to do the append to polygon, see if there's any other purple edges that show up. There aren't, so I step back, and I would do that for each of the objects if I need to. But it's just another step in the cleanup process to make sure you don't have holes or gaps. Also, during the UV mapping process, you'll find a lot of that as well. So in a lot of cases where I know I'm moving on to UV mapping, I don't necessarily need to use the append to polygon to be able to see if there's holes. As I'm doing the UV mapping and sewing things together, and even when I'm doing hard and soft edges, you're able to track down some of these problems. For example, if this edge actually was a hole where it was a gap because there was vertice, I appended across, delete the vertice, but those still weren't combined. If I tried to soften that edge, so mesh display soften edge, it wouldn't actually be able to soften. It would stay as a hard edge because it would say, well, no, we can't soften that. That's a hole. There's 2 edges here, and so they both stay hard. So there's a lot of different things you can be looking at to make sure that you're doing proper cleanup. And then once all that's done and everything's been cleaned up, deleted history, check for n-gons, check for back faces, clean up extra vertices, faces, all that stuff, then you would go and save the scene. So once again, make sure to do proper cleanup. So in this case, I will save scene as UV demo. Whoop, I don't have the caps lock on. UV demo, save that. And that's it for this module.